Okay, hello and good evening, everybody. Today I'm speaking to Dave DeCamp. He's one of the editors at antiwar.com, and he's been quite busy of lately. As everyone is who hasn't been living on a rock knows, there's a fight going on Israel-Palestine. So, David, welcome to this channel.
Thanks for having me back, Hugo.
Um, Question on this Israeli-Palestine. Where does one start with this whole issue? Do you start in the 12th century? Do you start in 1947? Do you start in 1912? Do you start in 1990? Or do we just start from last week?
I say the safe place to start is 1947, 1948, when they actually established, the modern state of Israel as we know it. You could go back to the early 1900s, late 1800s to when the Zionist movement really started. But the problems that we see today are really a result of creating a state on top of people's homes,
Right.
during what the Palestinians call the Nakba. About 750,000 people were ethnically cleansed from the territory, kicked out of their houses. And for the most part, these weren't tribal people. I'm sure there were some Bedouins in there, but people, that live in Gaza today that were made refugees and their kids are refugees. They still have the keys to the houses that they were kicked out of. So, of course, that's an important starting point. And as an American, they don't teach you that in school. I really had no idea until I was much older about the history of Israel. I always kind of just thought it was there. And then you have to get into the 1967 war when Israel took the West Bank from Jordan and the Gaza Strip from Egypt and began occupying those territories. And, the problem for them there is that there's a lot of Palestinians that still live there, unlike what they call Israel proper, where the original state was formed. And then, there's a lot to it. I don't know, how much history you want to get into,
Well,
but
I sort of know the history, and also like you, I read it secondhand because, believe it or not, in South Africa they don't teach you, at least not the school I went to. You also sort of figure it out as time goes on, and obviously, they nowadays draw the comparison with the apartheid state. In my view, some things can be compared, some things cannot, and the most obvious comparison that I think people miss is the apartheid state was dependent on black labor for its survival. Okay, Israel is not. And in my view, this is a very important distinction because that means Israel can, with its army that's armed to the teeth, level flat the Palestinians if there's an uprising. And this is sort of, just get your view on this, but this is my biggest concern with Gaza is that the Israelis go into war mode, and we know what happens in war. People don't think, and they just flatten things in their way.
yeah, and that seems to be what's happening with Gaza now. This Hamas attack was really unprecedented. People are saying Israel hasn't faced something like this since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. But that was a war between, I believe, Syria, Egypt was involved. These were Arab states. This is the first time that a Palestinian group has really done this much damage to Israel. And the response it seems to be their plan is to completely destroy Gaza. We've seen a lot of airstrikes in the past few days. The death toll of Palestinians in Gaza right now is pushing 900. Just in these airstrikes alone. And apparently the U.S. is expecting a ground invasion of Gaza. I mean, it looks like the Netanyahu government is going to use this, as the pretext to really destroy Gaza. And, I just don't see this thing de-escalating. The U.S. is fully supporting what Israel's doing. They're sending new military aid. They also offered to help out to give intelligence support in some kind of hostage extraction situation, which in Gaza would just be a complete disaster. And Hamas is saying they're going to start executing prisoners if the airstrikes don't stop. So I just don't see them backing down.
So I want to sort of backtrack to where this started. It started Saturday night. So I was surprisingly with Jewish friends of mine. As people know, my wife's Iranian. So it was a very awkward Saturday night because Iran was blamed very quickly afterwards for these attacks. And luckily that this morning, I think it's now safe to say that's nonsense from all the reports from Israel itself admitting it's nonsense. But I was close. We were close to a synagogue for what it happens to be. And Jews inside were obviously frightened when they heard the news. And I was thinking to myself, okay, if Jews in Paris, when I was in Lyon, actually can be so frightened, a few thousand kilometers away from Israel. What doesn't the Israelis look like? So I would imagine Israel at this stage to be a frightened society. Propaganda is gone all over, and they militarized, as you say, and they basically lock into it. Now, Palestinian one would also be frightened, but they don't have weapons. But just to sort of get on the question, what did the Palestinians do to frighten the Israelis so much?
Well, I think what it was the Hamas fighters were able to enter Israel. Typically their attacks on Israel have just been firing these rockets from Gaza, which are pretty crude. And usually when there's kind of a back and forth between Israel and Gaza, the casualties are, lopsided on the Palestinian side by a huge margin. I mean, I believe in 2021, that was the last kind of big flare up. It was over 250 Palestinians were killed and like 13 Israelis. So just the fact that these guys got into Israel and started killing people, and again, these casualty numbers, right? For Israel, it's about 1,000 now. I mean, this is huge for Israel. If you look back at these conflicts, so this is really an unprecedented thing. And just again, they always, I guess, lived under the threat of the rockets, but just the fact that you have guys showing up and killing people on the street, I mean, it's terrifying for anybody that lives in Israel. What's interesting is I'm seeing from Haaretz, which is a pretty prominent Israeli newspaper, liberal newspaper, they had an editorial blaming the situation on Netanyahu.
No.
And it's good to see that discourse is still happening inside Israel. It seems like it's more so in Israel than the U.S. In the U.S., if you say anything like that, you get
I mean,
all
but
sorts of
this is what I find very interesting about the U.S. rhetoric on Israel. In any other country in the world, with variations, you can at least have the debate we're having at the moment, where you can say Israel is not innocent, okay? Which is, I mean, it's underplaying of the facts, but you can at least say that in South Africa, or even in France. You can't say this in the U.S. I bet you can say it in Israel even. I bet some Israelis would say, look, this was going to happen. I mean, just get your view on another thing that's going around. There's a lot of people saying in the media this was an unprovoked event. Now, just give you, is this unprovoked? Because I saw people in the Al-Aqsa Mosque being beaten up a few months ago. I mean, obviously it's provoked.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you saw that became the language for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, unprovoked. And then as soon as this happened, you see everybody in the US, calling it unprovoked. And I mean, to call any, situation when it comes to this conflict unprovoked is just not like a serious way to look at it. Forget just what happened at Al-Aqsa Mosque recently, or all these raids that have been going on the West Bank. It's like, I mean, you just look at the history, and Gaza's been under, we were talking about the history. Really, the most important thing is that Gaza's been under blockade since 2007, and that's an act of war, So, I don't want people to ever think I'm justifying killing Israeli civilians, but you have to explain, the causes of these things. And that's just the fact that it's been under blockade, a pretty serious blockade since 2007. And that was a result of the elections in 2006 that the U.S. pushed for, that the George W. Bush administration pushed for. The people elected Hamas. And then there was sort of some faction fighting between the other Fatah, and it led to some fighting. And that was the pretext to impose the blockade. So that's, the people living in Gaza are in a very desperate situation. Unemployment numbers are insane. Like if you think about a lot of young Palestinian men who live in Gaza, and they have no prospects, no jobs, barely have clean water, they barely get electricity, and people are in a very desperate situation. Things were going to explode at some point. And I think what everybody's surprised by is the fact that they were able to actually get into Israel and do this. But yeah, to call it unprovoked, and you mentioned Al-Aqsa, so kind of the recent provocations since the Netanyahu government came in at the end of December 2022, his government includes very extremist Israeli settlers who want to annex the West Bank. They actually are settlers. They live in settlements, and now they're part of the government. So they're prioritizing expanding settlements, which is slow de facto annexation of the West Bank. There's been a lot of raids in the West Bank, which haven't happened in a long time. And one recently was in the town of Jenin, which is also a refugee camp. 1,000 Israeli soldiers, invaded the place to take out this resistance group. And, this has all been compounding on itself in the past year. And So it's really a response to that, as well as, of course, the long-standing issues.
Well, I was reading a thing today about, I'm sure you would know him, Robert, I think it's Pape at Chicago, on terrorism and suicide bombers that somebody sent me, where he makes this point, I'd like you to elaborate on it, that suicide bombers are motivated not necessarily by religion, but principally by the occupation of their homeland, which should not be a surprise to anyone who's seen resistance movements throughout Africa in the last century, or North and South America. But yet, why is it when we come to the Palestinians that it has to be any other reason that there's an uprising except the occupation?
Yeah, so it it is occupation, like you mentioned, suicide bombings. It's a common thing in any occupations or just bombings, that type of those types of tactics. I mean, you could look at Northern Ireland as an example. What was interesting, what was funny on Twitter, the IDF, the Israeli military, quote tweeted some Bono video or something, and they said that this attack was Israel's Bloody Sunday, which is just a ridiculous comparison because that
Right.
was British troops killing Irish Catholics. And it's what's more apt is that it's Israel's Bloody Friday, which was a response to Bloody Sunday. And there's a bunch of car bombings across Belfast, and a few soldiers were killed and a few civilians, a much smaller scale than what Hamas did. But that's kind of the response to occupation, is those types of tactics. And it's become a religious thing. It's really, one thing you hear a lot of people say is that, oh, this is a blood feud that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. But it's not really true. It's really it started with a land dispute, and kind of the more extremist factions, it's become more of a religious thing kind of recently. As far as I understand it, I'm not an expert on this. This is just me relying on people I know who know this situation better, and just from the books I've read on it. But you have Israel is a Jewish state, and they don't want more Muslim, a Muslim majority there. And you have, it's just kind of the natural result is this extremist group. And something Scott Horton's been pointing out a lot, is how Netanyahu himself and other Israeli officials have said Hamas is good. We want Hamas because the U.S. considers them a terrorist organization. That means we could isolate the Palestinians in Gaza. Nobody's going to take Hamas's side. That it turns everybody in Gaza into a target. So the extremists kind of fuel each other, and we see this in a lot of conflicts.
Yeah. And here's the joke to me, when South Africa, so we had something comparable in the 1980s, lots of violence, uprisings. You'd think you'd be in Gaza in those days. And after negotiations started, and nobody went to the negotiations, not even Nelson Mandela was squeaky clean. They all killed, they all had bombings, they all had planned, they did all these things. But as soon as it started, the extremists died very quickly. Okay, so it seems to be like the logical outcome here is just find some political compromise. But why can't we? I mean, it's now since, when is it, the 1990s that this thing has been just in stalemate. I mean, what is blocking, like, what seems to be either a two-state or a one-state solution, or whatever, some viable polity for the Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to imagine any kind of settlement happening right now. I mean, the thing that's blocking the two-state solution is the settlements in the West Bank. They keep expanding. If you remember, during the Trump administration, he released, the peace plan, what he called the deal of the century or something. And it was a proposal for a two-state solution that included, basically Israel partitioning the settlements in the West Bank, and also like the Jordan Valley. And, if you just looked at the map, it would turn, the Palestinian territory into the West Bank into Swiss cheese. Basically, there's little circles that are Israeli, and there would be Israeli only access roads, which there are, but it would basically formalize, what looks a lot like apartheid in the West Bank. And they would build a tunnel from Gaza to the West Bank, but it's just not a realistic proposal for the Palestinians. So that's what's really standing in the way for the two-state solution. And then the one-state solution, I don't know. As realistically, there's too many Palestinian Muslims for Israel to want, to say, all right, equal rights for everybody in the West Bank and Gaza. Let's become one big state.
But that's kind of what the whites said at the end of apartheid, is that the blacks will take over, there will be a genocide. Well, that didn't happen. Well, in fairness to some of them, it did happen a bit in Zimbabwe up north. So you've got two countries next to each other. One that did happen, one that didn't happen. But I think they fear ultimately majority rule, because as far as I look at the map, the two-state solution is dead. And there was an article in Foreign Affairs last year or the year before that was titled "Israel's One-State Reality," where the authors made just an obvious argument that it's for all practical purposes a one state, and given that the Palestinians, even those in Israel proper, are discriminated officially by law, you basically have an official apartheid state over there with homelands. So, that is what Israel is at the moment. How do you reform that? Is you extend full rights to the Palestinians. But it seems that is like, I mean, even people like Noam Chomsky has said that is like far away from reality. So I don't know what the solution is.
Yeah, me neither. And it's really it's clear that the status quo is untenable. This could have always exploded like this, and it's just I just can't see Israel backing down right now or considering any sort of one state solution after what just happened here.
Mm.
So we'll see. And it's not like the US is going to push Israel to do anything. They're just going to back them doing what they want here.
So there's no restraint even from the Democrats, because they tend to be sometimes a bit more restrained.
It doesn't, not that I've seen. I mean, the optics of this thing with Hamas going in there and killing civilians is just, no Democrats are going to say, call for restraint or anything. It's essentially they're going to back, even if it turns into a genocide of Palestinians living in Gaza, I think they're just going to support it.
Wow. Okay, that's quite frightening. I want to ask you on Hamas, this organization that is now this weird nightmare of a thing. Now, I looked at stuff that Sam Husseini shared today on Twitter, and Scott Horton shared it, and I think I shared the same thing to you that Scott shared, which is, it would seem that in the early 90s, to undermine the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat, Mossad started throwing money at Hamas, who at that time was a fringed organization. And the PLO, it's impossible to think of it today, consisted of Marxists and atheists, okay, and maybe a few Muslims, but they were obviously not serious about it. And Hamas seems to me to be a case that, okay, now we funded another Mujahideen, and we don't know how to contain it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that stuff that those guys have been sharing is really valuable for people to understand kind of more of the recent history. I don't think Israel didn't think they could pull anything off like this. They thought they could just keep them contained in Gaza and isolated and bomb them once in a while. And, I think that was really the plan. There's the question of how did Israel not know this was coming? This big intelligence failure when Gaza is one of the most heavily surveilled places on earth because it's under this blockade.
Well, somebody's explained to me this today, which is who was involved in Israel. They said the problem is, look, Palestine, Gaza, Hamas shoots rockets at Israel on a regular basis. And they've got lots of calls to respond to this stuff, because the Iron Dome, if you really throw rockets at it, will be overwhelmed. So the point is, they get a lot of these calls apparently that are just like, sounds a little bit crazy, and like, okay, they have to filter information. So it's conceivable that the thing would pass, in my view. The other thing is, I saw Egypt today apparently warned that this thing was coming. But my question is, how many crazy threats haven't the intelligence agencies seen that aren't threats either? So I don't really know what to make of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you have Egypt saying that. So it's just Egyptian officials saying that they knew something big was coming, but who knows how true that is? I think it's definitely worth pointing out, what they're saying. But there's some people, more conspiratorial minded that want to say Israel might have let this happen as a pretext to destroy Gaza. But I find it hard to believe that Israel would let this many something like this big. They didn't need something this big for the pretext to really go after Gaza.
The only thing now is they can all this allows them to is to go a little bit further than they would have gone under normal circumstances. Now they're going to kick more people out of their homes. This is my view, and they're probably going to flatten more buildings than they would have, because there's no opposition, I suppose, in Israel. Because if there is one, it's just you retreat and you side with baby killers. it's the easiest propaganda in the world.
Yeah. And that's another thing I saw this morning. There's this claim that the IDF found beheaded babies or something. And, these things we have to be skeptical of because there is this fervor and this war propaganda. It's a very common thing in every conflict. And right now, all I've seen is just a report from Israel's I-24 News that said the Israeli military told them that. So, if something that horrific happened, they're going to, whether or not it actually happened, it's going to spread like wildfire
Well,
now.
I'm just thinking, and people need to excuse me for it, but babies in incubators again.
Yeah, and babies on bayonets during that was World War One propaganda.
Yeah,
That the
it's
Germans
like
were.
classical. I mean, I've seen this also with the Libyan conflict and Ukraine, that they recycled
Mhm.
like Libyan propaganda. They just changed the title of the heading, basically. But it's
Yeah,
almost the same article. So it just seems to me that, I mean, if it's true, it's true. I don't put it beyond Hamas to do it, but I would like to see a bit better evidence before I claim. And
yeah,
even if true, what does this mean? Does it mean we need to go and flatten more buildings? I mean,
yeah.
you
That's
know.
what they're going to say. It means.
On the just back on this question of Hamas, so 2000 and when was it, 5 or 6? Can't remember now. Bush, Palestine voted for Hamas. As far as we can tell, that vote was legitimate. Now, here's the question I've got: is it would seem to me that the PLO, what's left of the PLO, doesn't have any legitimacy left among the Palestinians. So, isn't this maybe just a case that the Palestinians have some kind of democracy? Okay, it's obviously not perfect, and we just don't like their leaders at this stage.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I always hear people say, and again, this is I don't have all the details on this, but one thing I always hear people say is that the Palestinians are always electing Hamas, but I believe that 2006 election was the only one, right? Since they elected Hamas, the fighting happened with the PLO, and then Gaza was put under blockade. There hasn't been elections in Gaza since then, as far as I
Right.
understand. Um, but anyway, yeah, it was funny. It's the George W. Bush administration pushed for those elections, and then they elected people they didn't like, so they took action. And the U.S. Elliot Abrams, of all people, who is notorious for his role in the Reagan administration and interventions in Latin America, the Iran-Contra scandal. He was Trump's point man on the Venezuela coup. Well, when he was in the George W. Bush administration, he pushed for basically a coup against Hamas. So the U.S. was pushing, the other Palestinian factions to work against Hamas, which led to the fighting that was used for the blockade. So, you see this U.S. intervention really ingrained in this issue. So yeah, I mean, we've seen these examples, especially in Egypt. They had elections, they elected the Muslim Brotherhood. The U.S. didn't like that, so they backed a coup there, and it just really exposes the whole facade that the U.S. really cares about democracy. So yeah,
Yeah, they care about their guy being in charge.
Mhm.
Or they care only about Israeli democracy, but they've had made no attempt at establishing democracy or even just a viable state for the Palestinians. Which has been my biggest critique of that whole thing. Just to ask you this, then, just a few minutes left. What do you make of the argument that this conflict can spread to the wider region with what's his name, Hezbollah and Iran, and all of the above involved?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. There's been fighting now on the Lebanon border. It seemed like at first it was Hezbollah fired a few rockets, Israel hit back, and that was kind of it. But then there are the Palestinian groups in southern Lebanon and refugee camps there, and then they started attacking Israel, and Israel hit back and killed some Hezbollah guys. So now Hezbollah is kind of hitting back harder at Israel. So that has a possibility of erupting. But right now, it doesn't seem like Hezbollah is entering the war, saying like we're entering on the side of Hamas. And what's interesting, so you mentioned earlier the Iran stuff. Everybody was blaming Iran, and then Israel said no evidence of Iranian involvement right now. Israel is known for blaming Iran for a lot of things. If they wanted to escalate it, I think it shows Israel doesn't want escalation. I think right now they want to focus on Gaza, on leveling Gaza. And I think Hezbollah, again, that could kind of erupt more so than it has. So there's a risk there. But right now, it seems like the Israelis just want to focus on Gaza. And I don't really think anybody's gonna intervene if that, like, Iran or really Syria or
And
anybody. But if the
uh,
US, I think if the US gets directly involved, it,
mm.
we might see attacks on US bases in Syria and Iraq, stuff like that. I think that's a big risk if the US gets directly involved. Of course, they're giving them all the support, but if we start seeing US airstrikes or anything like that, I mean, then I think it could really explode.
Well, a point I make to people about Iran, and I was quite picky about this Iranian claim that is just complete nonsense, is if you go to Bushehr, and I was now this year there, the IRCG is a military base there, and there's air base, there's like a lot of military installments there. And they've got rockets basically facing the Saudi Arabian oil fields on the other side of the Persian Gulf and the Qatari oil fields or gas fields. So if Iran's ever going to be invaded and they feel desperate, which might make sense if the US throws its weight around, it's just going to shoot rockets and take the world economy down with it, right? In self-destruction. And this is sort of like, I don't think people understand the risks that's involved in this region. It's not small risks that's involved, which is why you need to calm the tensions. So ideally for the US, just get out, but you don't get out, right?
Now go all in. And that's the thing. Right now, it seems the people spreading the Iran involvement are the hawks in the US, that have their own agenda when it comes to Iran. That's where, the Wall Street Journal was the one that reported that. I mean, did you see that report? They said they had sources in Hamas and Hezbollah tell them on Sunday, "Oh yeah, we planned this with Iran." Iran
It's
a few
clearly
weeks
fabricated.
ago.
And
Yeah,
it seems one of the Twitter posts he shared this on Twitter, where apparently one of the people writing it, his former boss, came out saying, "Look, I fired this guy for just lying as a journalist."
yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, at least the Iranian story, I think we can safely say, is complete BS. I just hope it doesn't get traction after
Yeah.
this.
And I mean, the idea, that they might be using weapons that that Iran has given them over the years is certainly possible.
Sure,
But
but also take into account there's been drifts between Iran and Hamas. I mean, I'm not really
mm,
involved into terrorist politics, but it's these groups are not uniform and they don't always agree and they fight among each other. And there's a lot of nuance there. It's
yeah,
not like Iran is like this puppet master controlling Hezbollah and Hamas, which is often asserted. No, they've got their own agendas and they don't always align with what Iran wants.
it's exactly right. I remember towards the end of the Trump administration, there was a lot of the Shia militias in Iraq. They wanted the U.S. to leave after killing Soleimani and killing their militia leader. And there was, Iran was going over there and saying, "Stop firing at the Americans, please." They're like, they wanted them to de-escalate, but they didn't listen. And it is, there's all these different factions among those Iraqi militias. Some are more aligned with Iran, some aren't really at all. But just because they're Shia, that's the way it's portrayed in the West, is, oh, they're all puppets of Iran. But they have their own agenda, and a lot of people didn't realize when the U.S. killed Soleimani in 2020, they also killed al-Mohandes, who was the leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which was this umbrella group, well, it still exists, of these Shia militias that was actually formed in 2014 to fight ISIS. So they were on the side of the Americans during that war. And then once ISIS was really destroyed, it became kind of a low intensity war between them and the U.S. But yeah, they have their own reasons, their Iraqi nationalist reasons to want the U.S. to leave.
So last question, just to ask you to make a small prediction. How long do you think this conflict's going to last? Do you have any idea?
I have no idea, but I mean, if I were to make a guess, I think this is going to last a long time. I don't know. It depends what Israel's next move is, if they're going to go full ground invasion. An Israeli military spokesman said the other day that their goal is to make sure Hamas cannot govern the Gaza Strip. So it sounds like regime change, which is something, Israel won't be able to sustain. So it sounds like destroying it. I mean, I think.
Well, this is a big issue because I happen to know somebody who was in the British Army who was in Northern Ireland in the 1950s and 60s, a very old man. And he always told me the IRA was the best terrorist because you arrest a few terrorists and next month you've got a bunch of new IRA members, right? And this was the problem that you had over there. So you're going to take out whatever leadership Hamas has left. I don't even know what they've got. And next month you come back and you've got terrorists again. Why? Because there's resentment there. It's going to create another movement of this sort. And let's just speak to the root cause, which is occupation.
Yeah,
So
especially, I mean,
it's not going to work. I'm sorry, regime change is just not going to work over there.
Yeah, if they really go in, because there's probably lots of, more moderate people in Gaza, but they have nowhere to go. You're destroying their homes. So a full Israeli invasion, I mean, to them, that's just a threat to everybody's existence in Gaza. So you're going to get way more people joining the fight if they do that invasion on the ground. And
What's the chances if they open the Egyptian border? I mean, because that's also closed. I mean,
yeah, I think they're taking some refugees, but I'm not really sure. But yeah, that's the thing. Egypt doesn't want millions of Palestinians coming in. That's something people in the US use to like justify what Israel does is, oh, Egypt doesn't let them in too. It's not just Israel. It's like, oh, because the Egyptians are not nice to the Palestinians, that
but the
justifies everything.
Egyptian army that is propped up by the US tax dollars, that
Yeah.
is not popular among its own people, because when Egypt had a democracy for a few months, they killed the guy and had a coup. Right. So Egypt is a rogue state. It's a US proxy, basically.
Yeah, and the billions that they get billions in military aid from the US each year. That was an agreement from, the Oslo Accords, basically based on how their relationship with Israel. So, that's kind of it's all about this whole thing. So
Right. Well, Dave, I'd like to say thank you very much for this chat. And yeah, please, people, please subscribe to antiwar.com. I mean, you've given me very good information the last few days to at least formulate my opinion on this conflict. And yeah, I encourage people to contribute there. Thanks
yeah,
a
it's
lot.
good to hear. We're trying to do our best with everything that's going on. So thanks for having me on again.
Thanks, man.